You're listening to the ROI channel. Hello and welcome back to the ROI channel, the channel that's obsessed with the art and science of return on investment. And I'm very excited today to have yet another special guest joining me on the channel. My guest today is Ladislas Maurice from The Wandering Investor. He is an international man of mystery, if ever there was one, investor, traveler, speculator, and just a wealth of knowledge. So I'm super excited to have him on the channel. We are going to learn a little bit about Ladislas and his background, his journey. We're going to learn about his services and what he offers. We're going to talk a little bit of macro. We're going to dive into the world of offshore living and investing, traveling as a perpetual traveler, the dream that not most, but a lot of people have. And then we're going to go into our classic ROI segment where I really tease out the details as to the best investments Ladislas has made. Ladislas, my friend, how are you?
Good, good. How are you, Benjamin?
I'm very well. All the better for seeing you. Where are you joining us from today, sir?
From Playa del Carmen in Mexico.
Playa del Carmen sounds much, much nicer than the cold weather I'm experiencing here. That's excellent. Laz, what I might get you to do, if you don't mind, is just take 2 minutes to give us a brief overview of you, your history, and your background, and this incredible journey that you've been on over the last couple of years that we've all been following you with envy on social media, your life of travel, investment, and learnings. So take it away. Tell us who you are, where you come from, and what you've been up to.
Sure, thank you. So, look, I started off doing my bachelor's degree in Canada in international business. Then I went to graduate school in Australia, in your beautiful country. Went to study business and law at the University of Sydney. And then I went into the dark hole of corporate for quite a few years. So I joined Nestle at their headquarters in Switzerland, and then they sent me off to Africa for 7 years. So my last role in corporate was being in charge of the milk business for Nestle for a few West African countries based out of Ghana. So I was on the executive board there. So corporate, 50 to 70 hours a week. We all know the drill. And then at the age of 30, after having spent most of my 20s in Africa, I just decided I wanted a new challenge. I wanted to do something new. And my thinking initially was to get a job in Dubai. But first I was like, hey, let me go on a nice road trip. So I took a car and drove from Oman to Paris. So going through the UAE, going through all of Iran, Armenia, Georgia, Abkhazia, all of Turkey, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, and then west to Paris. So it was, one, a lot of fun, but two, it was the first time that I actually found myself in a position where I had money. So, a decent amount of savings and investments, and the time to reflect on what to do with my money. Because it's an issue that a lot of us find ourselves, it's a problem for a lot of us, is that we work, 50, 60 hours a week. We're driven. If, people are listening to this to your podcast, they're probably interested in investing. So they're probably listening to this on, on their way to work or something, and they don't have enough time to manage their own finances. But for once, I had a completely free schedule. I could go anywhere in the world and I could explore and find and see and spot all of these opportunities in these countries. So I started doing some flips in some of these countries, buying, selling, renovating, selling, doing a bit of developer financing. And I kept pushing back the, looking for a job part. I was like, oh yeah, Dubai, I'll do that in 3 months, et cetera, et cetera. And I wasn't really sending CVs. I was just, doing my flips. And after a while, I just never even, got back to trying to get a job or anything. I started doing this full time. And after a year or two of this, my friends started asking me, because I was posting pictures of myself in all these random countries. They'd be like, Ladislas, like you're posting all these, like you're in all these weird countries. Like, what do you do? Like, you had a good career before, now you're just, posting these random pictures. And, so I just started this blog trying to explain my process and also just to lay out my investment thesis. It helped me to just be able to sit down in front of my computer and before making an investment in a market to just lay out the thesis in writing, publish it, and then receive, criticism, because it's the best way to test a thesis is to put it out there to the world. And, there are typically people that are a lot smarter than me that then, comment, etc. I get feedback, and that's very helpful. So I just started this on a blog, and gradually people started getting in touch with me, and, it was fun. And then it started taking a bit too much of my time. So then I started offering consulting services, and then it morphed into a YouTube channel and to a whole bunch of other stuff. So now I run this part-time consultancy, thewanderinginvestor.com. So it's a blog, it's a YouTube channel where I help people internationalize and diversify essentially their lives from an investment point of view, from a residency point of view, and also from a citizenship aspect.
Excellent, great answer. And there's nothing like building a business based off market feedback that is knocking down your door. It sounds like that there was the demand for your services. Guys, we're going to put Ladislas's details in the description of the video today, so that if you feel like you could use Laz's help, you can absolutely get in contact. And a disclaimer, I've used Ladislas's services personally, and I found it all very, very good in terms of referrals to the right people to help with setting up permanent residencies and flags, as we call it, overseas. So, mate, we're going to delve into that further into this interview. Briefly, I'll get your view on the world with a little bit of macro commentary, because you are in a very unique position. You're the guy on the ground with boots on the ground and can really get the pulse of the street. And because you move around so much, you've got such an intelligence nodes of what is actually happening and how that differs from one country to the next, with, be it COVID or with everything that's going on with potentially sovereign debt crises at the moment. What's the number one trend you're seeing at the moment with regards to offshore living? What are people coming to you and asking for your help the most?
So if you'd asked me 1 year ago, it was a lot of Westerners who wanted to move to places where they felt they had more freedom, personal freedom, and where the government just wasn't as involved in their own personal lives. In the last 6 months, it has shifted dramatically. And, I don't want to be the doomsday sayer here on your channel coming up, oh, World War, blah, blah. But this is literally what people are getting in touch with me now. And we're not just talking conspiracy theorists or whatever. We're talking, people with a lot of money and, that have very good careers or very good businesses. And they're now very much worried about conflict, like a major conflict. And they are trying to get ready for it. I have clients that are just selling everything they have in some European countries, and they're moving to Latin America, for example. So, obviously not everyone is as drastic, but a lot of people are now thinking, I need to have assets in a country that is politically neutral. I need a residency in a country that is politically neutral. So that if things, I don't want to say if shit hits the fan, but, if things take a bad turn, then I can go somewhere. So that's what myself and my family. So that's what people are doing right now. So I'm speaking of this from a very, like I got impacted by this whole, Russia-Ukraine thing. I had residency in Ukraine, a business, personal ties. I was about to make a very large investment in Ukrainian real estate. I had signed the subscription documents for a fund, and the conflict started before the fund was actually ready in terms of banking. So I dodged a bullet on that side. But then I had a bunch of Russian stocks, and all of them got essentially frozen by Western sanctions. So, so before you had people that wanted to invest on the other side, thinking, oh, we're just printing money in the West, et cetera, et cetera. I prefer to have money on the other side so that in case of issues, I'm hedged. But now we're finding that actually investing on the other side, with the way the West is now conducting conflict and conducting essentially war, your assets, if they're on the other side, get frozen by your own governments. So that's just not really a possibility anymore. So now, if you want to hedge, you have to go for countries that are neutral. And that's what people are doing now. So they're getting residencies in Latin America. I'm helping a lot of people with this. They're getting Turkish passports. So Turkey is a whole world of its own. It's not without any geopolitical risk, that's for sure. You know, whenever there's war in that area, at some point, often Turkey gets dragged in. But for now, they're playing their cards very well. So people are attracted by this passport, and then it can give them access to other markets. As long as Turkey doesn't get involved, then they can invest on the other side. For example, if you want to buy Russian stocks now as a Westerner, very hard. If you want to buy Russian stocks as a Turk, it's not a problem. So people are hedging.
Very interesting. And you mentioned places that are politically neutral, and I am a big fan of your work, as I've said, and I listen to you and I listen to the Doug Caseys of the world. And one question that often comes up is, well, where do you go? If things really get as bad as they potentially could, how many viable options would you say there are for political neutrality? How many countries would there be where you would say, yeah, that's fairly neutral? Traditionally, people think of Switzerland, and you mentioned Turkey. Where would you say the number one or maybe 1 to 3 countries are that people are looking to go for specifically for that type of neutrality?
So very good question. So if you say, you know, what sort of countries, I'd say actually most of the world, because we live in an information bubble. We are led to believe that the world has taken a very strong position in the current conflict. The reality is most of the world is just staying neutral. They're doing business with everyone. They're trying to stay out of it. They see it's messy. They do not want to get involved. So most of the world in Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America is just not getting involved. So they're all neutral. Now, in terms of viable places, it depends what you're into. If you want places with, you know, good infrastructure, decent banking, etc., there aren't that many countries out there, or that it's easy to move to. You know, like most countries in Africa, you can move to. Generally, you need to, you know, create a company, appoint yourself the director, you know, bill a bit of money so that the company seems to be active, and boom, you're in. But, you know, I haven't come across many people who want to live in Africa, though there are actually some very nice countries to live in. I mean, I lived there for 7 years, and it's nice. And for people who like freedom, Africa offers a lot of freedom, and in many cases, a lot of safety, much more safety than Latin America. But no one's interested in Africa. People mostly want to move either to Southeast Asian countries, but then again, people have become a bit skeptical of Southeast Asian countries, the way they handled their borders during the whole medical situation. So that's not very appealing when you know, when you can just suddenly not go back to your country of residency, or, you know, lockdowns last for months and months. That kind of puts a bit of a question mark on the plan B thesis. So you're left with places like Dubai, but I mean, you know, Dubai, very bling bling. The whole Gulf is very bling bling. Some people are into that, others not so much. And then you've got Latin America. So, you know, in Latin America, you've got a few countries. The top ones are Mexico, you know, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Panama, Colombia, Paraguay. So 2 that are very popular because from a tax point of view, they're great as well. They're territorial tax systems. So generally speaking, again, this is not tax advice, but generally speaking, overseas income, when you become a tax resident of these countries, and as long as you're not a US person, is not taxed. So if you live and become a tax resident of Panama or of Paraguay, and you earn money outside of these countries, you don't actually need to pay any taxes whatsoever. So this becomes very attractive for a lot of people. So they get to leave their high tax countries, move to a country where it's warmer, where people are pretty relaxed, I mean, right now I'm in Mexico. I went to the barber a few days ago, and he was asking me, oh, it's not finished, the whole Ukraine Russia thing. Oh, it's not finished. And he was just there like listening to reggaeton and talking crap, and life is good. So
A whole world away,
so
as they say.
yeah, yeah, it's not like your barber in Europe that has a very strong opinion about what's happening. And here it's people are pretty relaxed. So it's Latin America from that point of view is proving to be the safe haven that it's always been. Now, is it the best place to invest? Not necessarily. There's a reason Latin America isn't really rich. It's because they have their own issues. But every 80 years or so, it's good to leave the Western world for a few years because there's war. So am I saying that, now, this is the case now? I'm not going to speculate on this. This is people's own personal decision to make in terms of decisions, lifestyle, risk, how they view the risk. But if people view this to be a big risk, then Latin America is definitely a good place to spend a few years.
Absolutely, and there seems to be a huge trend that I'm following with, and it may just be me in terms of the groups that I'm a part of, but Latin America seems to be very, very popular at the moment. But that was an excellent overview, a trip around the world with Ladislas in about 5 minutes to get a sense of where you can go depending on what you are looking for. And guys, obviously today, as you know, disclaimer is always in the description that anything that's said with in regards to investing or tax or citizenship, it's just for information, entertainment purposes. It's not personal advice. So you need to seek the advice of a professional. If you need help linking up to a professional, Ladislas can of course help you to do that. And gee, I really
You
want to
know,
delve.
sorry to interrupt, you
No,
mentioned,
go.
but you see, this is the sort of thing. You live in Australia, you're just doing a podcast, you're helping people, and you've got to come with all these disclaimers and all of that because the Australian government is just getting involved in everything to such an extent that you have to repeat this over and over and over. When you move to a Panama or even more a Paraguay, no one cares. No one cares. You just live your life.
There's
Just like
a
in the in
common
the in
sense
the old,
factor.
like Australia back then when it was still a place of freedom and people were relaxed and you're just doing your thing. And it's just become like Australia's just become sad.
Yeah, there are certainly some unfortunate things, and as you mentioned, it's one thing. I say one thing online, and perhaps something a slightly different version offline. But in terms of moving into the theme of investment, because that is where most of the listeners are focused. What is the biggest trend you've seen with regards to investing? And I'm very happy that you broke it up between perhaps residency and lifestyle. A lot of people are interested in Latin America, but for investment, maybe that's not the case. Or personal safety, there might be some question marks. With regards purely to investing, where would you suggest a lot of capital may be flowing over the next 1 to, who knows, 10 years?
Look, energy is clearly a topic, but you discuss this a lot on your channel, and I'm not going to be the guy who's going to be coming to your channel and talking about energy because, you do that a lot. You've had great experts on your channel. So essentially energy, I'm bullish energy. So, I go around, I travel around the world, I talk about all these investments, I talk about real estate, I talk about, residencies, all that. But I'm not just exposed to emerging market real estate. Sometimes people have that impression. That's why I also do sometimes, podcasts on energy, because I think it's important to be diversified across not just jurisdictions, but asset classes. And, I have some stocks in energy, et cetera. So that's definitely one aspect, which, you cover very well. The second thing that I see people increasingly buying, though they've been very disappointed. And I mean, again, people that follow your channel probably are invested in gold, physical gold, but I'm seeing people that before never considered gold at all, and now they're starting to buy physical gold just because
I
they
agree.
can sense something is absolutely not right. So the price trends of gold clearly don't demonstrate it, So,
Yet.
but people, I'm seeing normal people, including in my own family, who before just laughed at me when I mentioned gold. Now they're contact me on WhatsApp and they're like, "Oh, Ladislas, where's that place where I can buy gold with cash?"
Yeah.
And those are just very normal people in Europe. And now they're starting to just, they're buying like a 50 gram here, 100 grams here. They're not going all in, but they're starting to buy a little bit. And once they hold it, they're like, "Oh, this feels good. This is cool." So I think this is definitely something. I still view it, I view gold more as an insurance policy than a speculation. Physical gold, paper gold, different topic, miners, also speculation, etc. And then the third one is, again, real estate in emerging markets that are in neutral countries. So, like we discussed, people want to have assets outside of their home jurisdictions, outside of the West, and also something that they can touch and feel. And why is real estate interesting in these countries? Two things. Because when you look at real estate in the US or in your country, in Australia, people go around saying, "Oh, I like real estate because it's a real asset. I can touch it." It's like, sure. I mean, you can touch your house in Melbourne, sure. But the reality is that 3/4 of the price of this house is essentially financialized, is linked to, is a financial asset. Maybe only 1/4 of the price of that house is a real asset. 3/4 is just due to interest rates, policies, and the whole, machine go burr. But when you buy in emerging markets where the interest rates are already really high, like in Mexico or like in Colombia, you're buying into cash market. So what you pay, it's actually, that's what the actual value of the house is based on the market without any intervention from central banks. So on the way up, like in the last 10 years in Australia or in the US, being in cash markets, like in emerging markets, just doesn't make sense because you're missing out on the whole party. But if we're going to enter a world of sustained higher interest rates, then actually you want to be in those cash markets because there's actually a lot less downside. So counterintuitively, it's actually cheaper.
I think that's going to be
Less risky, sorry. It's less risky.
Yeah, that's a super important point considering how interconnected these complex systems are. And the whole financialization of assets, particularly in Australia, is so interesting. And a word on gold. It's interesting you say that. I'll send you an email after we wrap up about people look. We get so one dimensional in the Western world. People are obviously measuring the price of gold in US dollars, but with me tracking gold, for instance, against my local currency, the AUD, gold has actually done reasonably well over the last year. Against, if you're in Japan, you'd be quite glad to hold a little bit of gold. It's actually appreciated against the yen.
True.
Turkish, if you're a Turk or if you're in Lebanon, for instance, I mean, gold has saved your butt over the over the last few
Yeah.
years from all this financialization of assets. So this gives, I guess, a window into this 360 dimensional view of the world that you have, as opposed to someone who may be stuck growing up in one part of the world and not understand what's going on in another. So I think that mindset is key. Continuing on with the theme of offshore living and investing, I've got a quote that I've got from you, and I'd like you to just give a brief your thoughts on that. And your quote is, "My method is that I never rush. I go somewhere and stay there for a few weeks or months. I build a network, do thorough research and due diligence, and make my moves. By acting this way, I can mitigate the risk of investing in higher growth and yielding markets. Such an approach is also what I use to investigate various asset classes." I think that is super important in today's day and age where we have potentially some of your clients, even people in the West that have invested. They're coming up on retirement and they're really at the wrong end of the debt cycle in the sense that they had a lot of savings instruments and financial assets that are trying to compete against the printers of central banks. So talk us through your approach when you go to a new country and you're just starting getting the boots on the ground. What are the first 3 to 5 things that you do, and why have you decided that that's important, an important approach for you to take?
So that's a very good question. So first, it even starts before I go to the country because I analyze the country from a macro point of view. So is the country on the right track from a macro point of view? If I see some interesting macro developments, then I go there. And
And
then
how
I
do you
ask
work
myself,
that out? How do you work that out from your desktop? Or what
look,
indication?
there's no exact formula. I've had people like trying to like ask me how do you do it? What's the formula? There's no real formula. It's just general knowledge, following the news, looking at the numbers, debt to GDP ratios and reforms and politics and all of that. And then comparing that with the price of assets. And does the perceived risk match the price of the assets or not? And are there interesting catalysts? So it's just about looking in which direction is the country going and how are assets priced and how is that change likely to impact asset prices. And then when you get to the country, you ask yourself, how do I play it? Because a lot of these emerging markets don't necessarily have many ways to play the market. It's not like in Australia where you have, real estate and you have all these stocks and et cetera, et cetera. A lot of these countries, there's no stock market, or if there is, you know, there's nothing to do there. It's not liquid, there's nothing happening. Or real estate. And sometimes in these countries, real estate's really expensive because anyone that has money to invest, they often can't necessarily take it out of the country because of capital controls.
Mm.
Or if they can't take out of the country, people are just not sophisticated enough from a financial point of view to, buy stocks in the US or in Europe or buy overseas property. They're just not really into that. So what they do is they just buy local real estate and help their cousins start the little shop or the chicken farm. So you can find yourself in a situation where real estate prices are actually quite inflated and not that attractive, and yields are very low because everyone just piles into real estate. And if it's a country with a lot of red tape, there's not necessarily that much supply of real estate, of ongoing extra supply. So the prices of whatever is there are just inflated. So you really need to go there yourself physically and to see how to play the market. So, you go speak to real estate agents, you speak to lawyers. Lawyers are, lawyers in capital cities that are well connected are usually good people to talk to because, they're connected to a lot of businessmen. So they know what's happening. They get the feel of the landscape. And expats. So, there's always the perpetually negative expat in all these countries. So you got to, listen to them. They've got a perspective. Then you have the overly optimistic expat. And sometimes you also find an expat who's fine, and you try to get the opinion from everyone, and that helps. So it's about, going out and paying beers to people. Honestly, I pay a lot of beers.
And that's a big part of the service that you offer is that you have been able to do that for many years now, and you've been able to condense that wealth of knowledge to a person who's just getting started and saving them so much time and money and potential mistakes and heartaches along the way.
Yeah,
So,
because most countries I go to, they sound interesting. I go there, I spend a few weeks, a few months, and then I don't invest because it's not the right market. The one paper looks great, but actually, no. Like for a while, Serbia was top of mind during the whole lockdowns, etc. Serbia was pretty open. The border was pretty open. People could get residency. So a lot of people wanted to move to Serbia, invest in Serbia. But there just wasn't that much that was investable. The prices were already very high in terms of real estate, and the local capital markets are just wholly undeveloped.
and we've touched on why people who are serious about protecting their assets, investing for their future, should diversify more globally. Let's get into the weeds a little bit in terms of how do you get started with that? There are going to be things like opening a foreign bank account, obtaining foreign residency, which we mentioned, or second passport. How does one start the process of planting these various flags abroad, or at least getting opportunity into investing um, in something that's globally diversified?
Good question. So, I mean, the first thing is you can open a bank account generally in other countries remotely in some countries. So, you do that. It's a bit of paperwork. It'll take some time. You do it remotely. You'll have to, get a few documents certified and send them with FedEx or DHL. And you'll have a bank account overseas. You transfer some money. You make sure you comply with your local laws where you're a tax resident in terms of, declaring overseas bank accounts. You don't do it to hide money. That doesn't work anymore. So that's one step. But I think that the best step is to buy real estate overseas, because that is something that is far away. It's hard for, people who are after you to seize that. It's complicated. And in many cases, overseas real estate entitles the investor to residency as well. So, if you go to a Montenegro, a Panama, a Colombia, for example, in a lot of these countries, there's schemes, they have different minimums, but where if you invest in real estate in your own name, then you can apply for residency. And if you become a resident, you then often have access to better banking, et cetera, as a resident, because it's a lower risk from a compliance point of view. So that's one way of really doing it. Just choose a place where you either want just high yields, where you're just going there really for the investment. You invest and then you can have like a call option on residency, or go somewhere where you actually like spending time, and then where you can spend a bit of time and then put the property on Airbnb the rest of the time. Generally, those kind of mixes in terms of lifestyle and renting out are not the best from an investment point of view. But I mean, it's one way of putting, a foot outside of your own country. And it's something that a lot of Russians particularly have discovered, in the sense that many have left over the past, because Ukrainians, it was easy for them. They could just leave, and many countries in the world just accepted them as refugees. So, they could just arrive there, refugee status, etc. So it wasn't too hard for Ukrainians to obtain residency somewhere. And I'm not saying, life isn't hard on them. But for
Sure.
Russians, they had a different challenge. It's the challenge of sanctions. So just by being a resident of Russia, or a Russian in Russia, essentially you would get deplatformed, debanked, et cetera, and a lot of countries wouldn't accept you. So Russians that already had residency permits were able to just, go straight to where they had a residency permit, live there, get banking there, et cetera, and be set up and continue operating. And in places like Montenegro, where in the Balkans, south of Croatia, a little country of 600,000 people, a lot of Russians own real estate there. So what happened is many of them just went, when the conflict started, they flew over to Montenegro, they arrived in Montenegro, and they applied for their residency based on real estate ownership. So the real estate for them had always been an investment, sometimes a bit of a lifestyle as well. But then in this particular case, it became an active plan B / actually plan A for a lot
A
of them,
lifeline. Mm.
a lifeline. So this property was a call option on a residency that allowed them to continue functioning in today's world from a financial point of view.
That's super important because let me delve into this. Living in our little bubble in which I live in Oceania, when I tell people that, look, I've got various residencies on the go and things like that, they say, oh, what, you're going to up and move and live the rest of your, like, they think every second of my life is now going to be lived in the next in the next residency. And it's not about that. Explain the difference briefly for people here, that having that residency doesn't mean you have to pack up and move your entire life permanently forever in a different location, guys. It can just be an extra, a call option that you mentioned. And explain briefly the difference between your tax residency, your residency as in where you physically reside, and a passport or citizenship.
Sure, very good question. So a residency is essentially generally a little card that gives you residency rights in the country. It means that at any given point, you can go to that country, you can live there, you can typically work there as well. You're a resident of the place, you generally have the same rights as a citizen apart from, voting, having a passport to travel, and, joining the armed forces.
So you got a visa-free entry, you got the
Yeah.
ability to own property, and hypothetically speaking, of course, if you were in a place and there was a certain event that might occur and your borders became locked to one particular group of people, you might be able to use that as an ability to leave that particular place, perhaps.
Yes. So that's also one thing, because you can go through borders, and like I know through one of my own countries, I was trying to leave during the whole situation, and they wouldn't let people leave if they couldn't prove they actually lived overseas. And thanks to my residencies, I was able to say, "Oh, I'm going home."
Wow.
So
So valuable.
that's one aspect. And then those countries who had their own borders closed would let me in because I'm a resident. So I have the right to come in, but everyone else was closed off. So that's one aspect. So then tax residency is when the government of the country where you have residency accepts you as a tax resident and makes you pay taxes. All right. So every country in the world has a different interpretation of tax residency. In many cases, in emerging markets, if you spend at least half of the year in a given country, or if you have the center of your life interests in that country, and you still spend a lot of time, the government will grant you tax residency, will make you pay taxes locally, and then you can get your tax certificate. Places like Australia, very complicated to become a non-tax resident. It's very possible. A lot of Australians do it. I've helped a lot of Australians, leave Australia from a tax point of view, but it's a process. It's not easy to become a non-tax resident of Australia. You really need to just, almost get rid of everything. US, different topic, very hard because they tax you on citizenship, based on your citizenship, not necessarily even where you live. So that's tax residency. And then there's citizenship, which is having the passport of that country. So simply, if you come to Mexico, for example, so Mexico's an easy one. You can easily become a resident of Mexico. There are many ways you can become a resident of Mexico. So then you do the paperwork, you become a resident of Mexico. Great. If you spend 2-3 months of the year here, they're not going to tax you. Even 4 months, they're not going to consider you a tax resident. So you're cool. You can chill here for 4 months of the year. You're a resident. You can bank. You can buy a car. You're free to do whatever you want to do. But just you're not a tax resident. If you suddenly decide to spend at least half the year, or you start developing a lot of links to Mexico, or they could argue that the center of your vital interests are in Mexico, then you become a tax resident. So then Mexico, just like Australia in your case, would tax you on your worldwide income. And taxes are pretty high in Mexico. So generally, Mexico, you do not want to become a tax resident of. But let's say you want to get citizenship, you want to spend 5 years in Mexico, spend 5 years in Mexico. After 5 years, you become a Mexican citizen. You can apply for citizenship, and you have yourself a nice Mexican passport. It's actually a very good passport. And it's probably worth paying a bit of taxes for to obtain. And then you're a Mexican citizen. You're a citizen of a neutral country. And that comes with potentially a lot of advantages in the future, if we're going to go into a scenario of that, some people are thinking of.
Absolutely. So it's certainly achievable for you to diversify offshore in terms of your residency, banking, and tax situation, guys. But as you can tell from that answer, it's a very nuanced subject. So
Yeah.
in order to get things right, because there are quite severe consequences if you make a mistake, please do get in touch with professionals. And again, Laz can put you in touch with those people to save you a hell of a lot of hassles. All right, well, now it's time for ROI time. This is a segment where we get to be specific about the theme of return on investment. And Laz, what I do is I always have a series of questions that I ask my guests. And the first one is, what is your highest ROI from any investment up to this point in time? Tell us a bit about it.
Uranium.
Uranium.
Yeah, uranium.
Hold your feet to the fire. How are you playing the theme? What sort of ROI have you been able to achieve? Tell us where are we investing in with regards to the uranium theme?
Look, I mean, obviously this is not investment advice. I got in very early, so it's a different, topic. So it's a different risk profile, put it this way. I got in mid 2019, and I participated in a bunch of private placements back then. I actually caught the bottom in uranium. I was exposed to it through a friend who just, we were having coffee, and he shared the thesis, and I thought it was interesting. I looked into it. I hadn't heard of it before, and then I went big. So that turned out very well. I'm still very long uranium. I'm a little jittery about everything that's happening right now. Hopefully people don't do stupid things in Europe. But uranium up to now has been very good. I like the African names. In mining generally, I like African names. I know they have a very bad rep because of, I don't know, like they always come at a discount. But the reality is, when I look at the way people view risk in tier A jurisdictions like Canada, Australia, parts of the US, etc., and then I compare it with how people view risk in Africa, and then I look at the difference in valuations, it just doesn't quite make sense. Like, in many ways, Western countries are a lot riskier from a regulatory point of view than in Africa, where these governments, sure, they have their issues with corruption and all that, but they're not out there to trying to prevent you from doing business, or not wanting you to build the mine. They want you to build the mine, and they actually do make it relatively easy to build mines. I mean, if you go build a mine in Burkina Faso, it's a lot quicker than trying to build a mine in Canada or in Australia. So, and I feel that the huge discount that African, and again, it depends which countries. Africa is big, 52 countries.
That's my
South
next
Africa
question.
is, I wouldn't invest in South Africa,
A lot of people
but
talk
in
about
Namibia,
Namibia. Yeah.
yeah, places like Namibia, even Malawi, etc. A lot of countries that are very investable from a mining point of view, and they're trading at big discounts that I feel are not justified, especially if we're entering a world where it's going to be East versus West. What's going to happen? Africa being neutral, right? Being really, really neutral compared to Latin America, which is still a bit of a US, backwater. Africa is very much neutral. So if China is going to want to get natural resources, they're going to bid up the prices of these companies. So when I invest in these African companies, I always think of, China as a potential exit.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. And in terms, yeah, it's so interesting to see how the world is changing. You've got your BRICS alliance, Turkey, Argentina, just voiced their support that they're looking towards being more East friendly. And it's absolutely, as you say, whether you're starting to become a more polarized world, you can't necessarily put all your eggs into one basket. In terms of the asset class, we've got uranium. In terms of countries or regions, you mentioned Africa. Is there anywhere else that takes your fancy from a real estate perspective, because you're known as a real estate guy? A lot of people talking about Tashkent, Uzbekistan, from a demographic point of view. Any comments on those areas?
Yeah, Uzbekistan is an amazing story. The reforms they're doing are fantastic. The demographics are great. There's industry, there's agriculture, there's mining, there's energy. They're the crossroads of everything that's happening. Russia's investing, China's investing, India's investing, the Gulf is investing, Turkey's investing, the West is investing. It's just a flood of foreign direct investment into a country that has actually really good infrastructure and high education levels, and they're being very welcoming of the foreign capital, and they're using it quite well. So and the valuations are still very cheap. So I'm very bullish Uzbekistan. Now, the only issue is in terms of real estate. If you want to buy real estate in Uzbekistan, there's several tiers now of real estate that you can buy into. So if you buy above a certain amount, depending on the regions, you can own in your own name as a foreigner. Some
That was going to be
cases
my
you
next
can,
question.
yeah, you can even get residency. But the core real estate that I'm particularly interested in the center, the old kind of Stalinist buildings, historical buildings from the Soviet Union, the nice quality ones, investing in those is still technically not very legal. As a foreigner, you can get away with creating a local company that then buys the real estate, but then technically you're not allowed to rent it out long term, unless if it's for a business activity. So then you have to, come up with some kind of odd contracts to kind of get around that. So it's not really in the spirit of the law. So there's always a bit of a risk, and it's a country where the security services are still, they're very active. They're very mindful of everything that's happening. So you can't really go there as a foreigner, do these things, and then hope no one will notice. They'll know. So it's just will they care enough? If you go the gray route and you're just doing it with one or two places, you're not worth their time. If you start
Fly
doing
under the
that at
radar.
scale, I think up to now, that's what people are getting away with, but things can change because, again, what you're doing is not in the spirit of the law.
Okay.
But if you start doing this at scale, you're just going to run into problems. So, and the ones that you can invest in directly in your own name, they're a bit more expensive. That's not where you see the ROI, et cetera. So from a real estate point of view, for now, it's a bit hard to play. It's playable I'd say if you enjoy ambiguity, because the level of ambiguity there, if you're going to play in these games, is quite high, and it shouldn't be about like just tolerating ambiguity. It should be about enjoying it, because it's pretty out there. So personally, I bought a bunch of stocks in Uzbekistan. So I own a bunch of companies locally. Okay. I prefer to play it this way. I sleep well at night.
Okay. Anytime you mention ambiguity, I start to think of that YouTube video going around of the fuck around and find out. And it depends on how much you push the accent or the axis on the fuck around as to how much you'll find out, guys. So don't be silly. Make sure you know what you're doing. In terms of the single biggest action listeners can take that will move their needles from an ROI perspective, what are your thoughts? What would that be? If I had to say, Laz, what's one thing I can do now? Let's say I'm a typical person like myself, business owner, active investor in the Western world. What's the single biggest action step I can take?
Look, I think in terms of your channel, you have a lot of commodities experts that come on board, and your audience is probably interested and invested in commodities. So when you look at the way mainstream media talks about commodities, just even stuff like, Bloomberg and all that, the way they've been talking about oil and uranium and gas and all that for the last few years, these experts, we're talking of people with PhDs and that teach at these great universities, and they're celebrated, and they were just so wrong. And fundamentally so. It was just a pure narrative that they were pushing. So you got to ask yourself, what other narratives are out there that are completely wrong, but just mathematically wrong, with just clowns talking nonsense? And because we're in a world that is so politicized, there are a few narratives around that you can potentially play. So you need to find them. How do you find them? It's by listening to alternative media. It's also by listening to the opinions of other countries that, our countries don't necessarily agree with, that, they're banning their media, etc. Actually find a way to watch them. So it's not, I'm not going around endorsing the other media, but I'm just saying, train yourself to always think critically and go and read. Sometimes I'll even read Venezuelan news, the communist propaganda. Like, do I think it's good source of information? Probably not. But sometimes they come out with very thought-provoking pieces that just help me intellectually to challenge some preconceptions I have. So just go out there, challenge yourself intellectually. Do not stay in whatever bubble you're in. Same thing with commodities. If we just hang out ourselves, we're gonna jump off the ship, jump off the train too late. So it's important to listen to the other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Very wise advice. There's something to be said for gaining a different perspective, always to challenging your thesis. And it's an interesting point. I mean, you mentioned so-called experts uh, really pushing a particular agenda and narrative. And I think what we've seen is that there's actually a wide variety of equally respected and equally qualified experts taking a different perspective, a data driven, empirically scientific driven perspective as well, but we don't get to hear from them if we're stuck in that one particular channel of media or communication. So absolutely couldn't agree more in terms of broadening our perspective, in terms of the information sources that we have access to. And if we're geographically or psychologically entrenched into one particular zone, we may miss that. So that's a huge deal, guys, huge deal. In terms of things that you have done personally in the past, like I know that you are multilingual and I'm multilingual, and it's been one of the biggest sources of return on investment for me, I suppose, not necessarily in a financial sense, but being able to have various different options. Um, what languages do you speak, and what has been your experience in terms of how that has helped you in your journey, particularly with such a worldly perspective that you now have?
Cool. So French and English, I mean, very useful, native speaker for both. Yeah, like Africa, French opens the door to Africa, all of that. So that's great. I speak German fluently as well. Honestly, German is just good if you want to, I don't know, like get a job in Switzerland or in Germany. If you just plan on like working for other people in Europe, Germany's probably the best. German is probably the best language to know if you want to work for other people in Europe. But if you're going to be an entrepreneur, German isn't really that useful, because any German in the startup world or whatever will speak English. So I find German not that useful from that point of view. I speak Russian as well. So Russian is very useful in the whole former Soviet bloc. You know, for example, when I go to Uzbekistan, etc., I get a lot of local insight. I travel a lot around the block, even in Ukraine. You know, you speak Russian, very helpful. So Russian really opens a whole world of opportunities in that former Soviet sphere. So that's very useful. And also when you watch other news channels in Russian, you get another perspective. Again, I'm not here taking sides or saying, but it's important to understand the other perspective. Very, very important, because what Western media says that, you know, Russian media says are actually very two different things. And when you watch like Russian channels in English, like RT, and what they say, the same government says in Russian to the Russian people, two very different narratives as well. You know, so everyone is playing everyone. Let's just be clear here. Everyone is playing everyone. So, you know, and I'm pretty sure, I don't speak any Mandarin, but I'm pretty sure that the English language Chinese news and the Chinese news in Mandarin targeting Chinese in China are two different worlds. You know, I wouldn't be
Not difficult to imagine. Yeah.
yeah. So that's that. And now I've been learning Spanish. So my Spanish is now good enough to, you know, do business. So, and that's very easy to learn. Spanish is very easy to learn. I don't give credit to anyone that learns Spanish, because it's very easy to learn. And it's fun. It's actually a very fun language to learn. Like German is not fun to learn. Russian is a bit fun, but it's like really hard. Spanish is easy and fun.
And in terms of, yeah, I always say to people, look, if you're an English speaker and, you know, growing up in Australia, if you only speak one language, you only have one perspective of the world. And so I can't recommend people highly enough to learn a different language. And Spanish seems to be the easiest one for people to take that second step from your mother tongue to the next tongue, Spanish. And look, I think second or third most popular or most widely spoken language in the world in countries such as Latin America that have emerging markets and very good demographics. Could be an interesting one. Portuguese and Brazil. I want to delve into that because Brazil is something like the um, eighth largest economy in the world, particularly focused in natural resources, which the world is needing. Energy security, from a national security perspective, has become a hot topic recently. And Brazil seems to have a mix of metals, agriculture, mining, and energy exports. And yet something like only like 12% of people studying languages study Portuguese. Where do you see Portuguese and Brazil in this whole kind of emerging situation from Latin America? It seems to me to be a sleeping giant. I'd be interested to get your thoughts.
I memean, the country's massive, but to be completely honest with you, I haven't spent enough time to be here, sitting on your podcast talking like an expert on Brazil. So I'll just skip this question. But just in terms of Portuguese, it's not just Brazil, but it's also places like Angola, Mozambique, which are themselves relatively big markets in Africa. So it's definitely a very useful language. I would encourage people to learn Portuguese for sure.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I've had a blast, but I've also got a list of more questions that I'd like to go down the rabbit hole with you in another time. So I'll have to get you back on in a couple of months and find out where you are in the world and what you're up to, and
Sure.
we can discuss any changes that may have taken place since then. Guys, we'll have Laz's details in the description. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with before you head off?
Yes, there is. Look, we talked about a few negative things on this podcast, and we're probably collectively going to have a few rough years ahead. But I think it's important that people, stay optimist. There is a world of opportunities out there. There's a big world, God, family, and be prepared. So that's all I want to say. It's possible to put measures into place to mitigate risk and to make sure that you come out on the other end better, in a better position than if you hadn't prepared yourself. So just keep the faith, be optimistic, and be aware of your core values, and just be prepared. That's it. Be prepared.
Wise words. It could be the best of times and the worst of times, depending on what we do in between now and then, guys. So be prepared. Get in touch with Ladislas from The Wandering Investor. And thank you, sir. I look forward to catching up with you in another episode of the ROI podcast. Take care,
Cheers.
everybody. Bye.